Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Scott Ott, recently back from a bad bout of laryngitis. And as you'll see in a few moments, it's made his voice very low and raspy and sexy, or in his very own words, sexy like Mr. Sexy, Mr. Haney on Green Acres. It's good to have you back, Scotty. We sure did miss you. And I'm doing the intro and the outro to the show to spare his voice as much as possible. So, as you probably know by now, this is a show where Scott's going to ask me a question, and I have no idea what it's going to be. I'm going to try and answer it, and then we will all go our merry ways. So, what have you got for me today, Scotty?
So, Bill, your old buddy Tom Brokaw got himself in a
Hmm.
little bit of a kerfuffle when he was a panelist on Meet the Press this week. And I want to give the exact quote that Tom Brokaw said and then a little bit about the aftermath. But he was talking about the issue of immigration, and he said that when he pushes Americans on the subject of immigration, quote, they say, well, I don't know whether I want brown grandbabies. That's also a part of it, the intermarriage that's going on and the cultures that are conflicting with each other. I also happen to believe that the Hispanics should work harder at assimilation. You know, they ought not to just be codified in their communities, but make sure that all their kids are learning to speak English and that they feel comfortable in the communities. And that's going to take outreach on both sides, frankly. Now, Bill, that's the full quote because I like to give the full context of it. Brokaw immediately began getting hammered on Twitter, not only from conservatives who thought they sniffed a little hypocrisy here on the left, where with to hear somebody talking about how the Latinos need to do some outreach toward assimilation, but also from liberals who were outraged that Brokaw said that Latinos need to do some outrage. I guess just first of all, on the surface of it, if that quote didn't come from Tom Brokaw, if you just heard somebody say that, what would you think of it?
As it turns out, by strange coincidence, just went out for a bite to eat just before we shot this, and I was coming back and I heard the clip on the air, and if I remember correctly, he said something to the effect of, "I've been talking to Republicans, and when you dig deep enough, you get," and so basically, as I heard it, I've been talking to Republicans, and they're all a bunch of racists. So
Well, the story
there's
in
there's that problem.
Deadline.com said he's been when he pushes Americans.
Yes, well, that's what he said. So anyway, uh, in this day and age, Scott, you got a pretty good sense that if there is an enormous amount of outrage about something that somebody said, it's almost certainly true. Um, Almost, not always, but almost certainly. At least when the left gets upset about it, it seems to be almost certainly true. They cannot allow anybody who represents their team to have a voice contrary to the standard narrative. And in this case, as in the case of inner city crime and all the rest of it, it's the progressives that are destroying. I don't want to say these communities. I hate saying these communities, Hispanic communities, Black communities. They're killing Americans, and they're limiting their options by basically telling them that if you just simply depend on us, then we'll take care of you. But all you have to do is vote. When when you're talking about immigration and the Spanish community having to do more outreach, to some degree, it's a responsibility of the Spanish Hispanic community, Latino community in America. But mostly, if you had to put the blame anywhere, I think it belongs on the shoulders of the progressives, who, for the first time ever in our history, starting with the Cuban migrants coming in large numbers to Miami in early '60s and so on, it's the first time in history where the country basically said, not only are we going to take care of you, but we're going to cater to your languages as well. So let me just elaborate that for a second. No question that in places like New York, there was always a little Italy and a little Chinatown and all the rest of it. And certainly those languages were spoken in those areas, as in Little Havana in Miami. I couldn't find anybody speak English there in 1977, something like that. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about whether or not you are pointing your future towards the English language because it is the language of the country you grew up in. And when Italian immigrants, as an example, would come over here at the turn of the previous century, they would speak Italian at home and they'd speak Italian to each other, the mom and papa. They'd have some broken English that they'd struggle with, but they would insist that their children speak English. They'd absolutely insist on it. Because you're Americans, you're going to grow up and be Americans.
Now, Bill, can I tell you what I first
Sure.
thought when I heard this Brokaw quote was that
Mhm.
was the part that rang false to me, because my experience in largely working in the marketplace with customers who are Latino customers, first-generation immigrants, is two things. Number one is all their kids speak English. And number two is it's kind of heartbreaking to some of the grandparents that the kids don't want to speak the mother tongue. You know, they don't want to speak the old country language. And so I don't know where Tom Brokaw hangs out, but my experience has been...
He hangs out in Los Angeles and New York. Things are a little different here.
You're just saying it's because I'm in Texas?
I'm saying it's because you're in Texas where gravity still works the correct way, you know, where things fall down instead of up still, at least for the time being. Like I say, I'm not indicting the Spanish community for this, Spanish-speaking community for this. I'm saying that once we decided to start putting on our answering machines, press 1 for English, press 2 for Spanish. Once we did that, we trapped Spanish-speaking Americans in a way that we hadn't trapped previous generations. And by the way, you know, if I have to press 1 for English, press 2 for Spanish, why don't I have to press 3 for German, 4 for Korean, 5 for, Italian? Why is it? It is an effort to make this a bilingual country, and bilingual countries don't work. It doesn't work up in Montreal. It doesn't work anywhere. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that if people are going to come and live in your country, they should be prepared to speak your language. I wouldn't expect to go to China and have them start speaking English just because I moved into the neighborhood. I think that'd be unreasonable and insulting.
Now, I don't want to make this all about the bilingual issue because I don't think that's the thrust of it, but I will throw in the fact, and if you want to address this, you can. But when the Constitution was first drafted, the initial copies were printed. I think it was something like 25% of the copies that were printed for circulation were printed in German. Okay. And so I guess that's not the most unusual thing about this whole issue. What I found striking was that Tom Brokaw breached something that's very important because the left, it seems to me, relies upon being able to cluster the Latino community. They have to refer to them that way. They can't talk about them as individuals. And that Brokaw fundamentally breached the wall that the progressive left has built around that community. Am I misreading that?
No, you're not. And this is kind of the motivation for the identity politics I was talking about a moment ago. Why would you bend over backwards to make sure that there are? Just take a great example from LA Unified School District. They had thousands. I don't know how many teachers employed in English as second language kind of things. And what it was, I imagine what it was intended to be was a series of classes that were taught in Spanish for people who had just arrived speaking Spanish, getting them to learn English. And all it did was it allowed them to get high school degrees without learning any functional English. And if you can't speak English to some fundamental minimum standards, you're going to be employed in the bottom sector of the economy for the rest of your life. And this is what this progressive idiocy has done. They always are telling you, no, you don't understand. We feel for the poor Hispanic people that come here and don't speak English. We're going to make all of these changes in our culture to make things easier for them because we're such big-hearted people. Well, what they do is they basically trap them into a language that is a language of poverty. I'm not saying the Spanish language is a language of poverty, but I'm saying if you don't speak English in this country, you will not be making a lot of money in America. And I don't find that, not only do I not find that hard to believe, I also don't find that particularly unjust.
And if you can speak English and Spanish, you'll make a little extra.
That's precisely correct. Yes, exactly. So when Brokaw says that the Spanish community, I keep saying Spanish because I hate Hispanic, I just hate that term, Latinos, let's say. Yeah. So if Brokaw says that the Latino community needs to do more for outreach, I agree with him 100%. With this important caveat. I think the Latino community absolutely does need more outreach in terms of raising their standards and so on. But I'd be willing to bet you that at least 8 out of 10 people of Latino ancestry in America don't consider themselves to be the Latino community. I bet they consider themselves to be American citizens. Okay. And I don't think that they need any trouble. I don't think they need any help with outreach at all.
Well, of course,
I think the only people that need help in terms of this, here's this little, minority unit, and as you said, encapsulating the Latino community. I think the only people that need help assimilating are the people that have bought this line that just vote for us, and we'll keep the benefits coming in both languages. And if you're made a prisoner of that by this decision on our part, and you spend the rest of your life in poverty, well, it doesn't matter really, because the main thing is we're getting elected.
Patronizing in both senses of the word, isn't it?
Yes, exactly right.
Here's of course what, as you would expect, Tom Brokaw stood up for what he said and defended his words. No, I'm kidding. He actually tweeted out the first in a series of multi-part apology.
I can hear the wording already.
Yes, and I want you to think about this wording of the first part of this multi-part apology. I feel terrible. A part of my comments on Hispanics offended some members of that proud culture. Do you hear contrition in this, my friend?
I hear a person who is realizing the consequences of his lifelong leftism, like so many others, liberal professors who are run off of their college campuses for, saying things like, maybe you should be able to wear whatever Halloween costume you want to. Burn him, burn the witch. You're talking about breaching the walls of this politically correct language and thought, Scott. And the thing that's kind of fun is those walls are getting thicker and they're getting smaller. This little circle of what you're allowed to say, and thank God, when I say what you're allowed to say, I mean what they're allowed to say. I have no doubt whatsoever that many, if not all, of the things that I've said just in the last 5 minutes are deeply insulting to various members of the Hispanic American community, and I don't care. It's true. You see how easy it is? Now I'm on the outside of the wall. So I'm going to get the slings and arrows that come from being outside of the wall, but I'm not going to be squeezed to death by these ever encroaching standards of what you are allowed to say. And if you should happen to have a thought that maybe was based on factual observation or something, you must immediately begin the contrition process, which is not just a kind of, hey, sorry, it's a full-on strip to the waist, get out the scourge, and just keep beating yourself.
Let's go a little
bleed.
further with that, and and of course, not to mention your offense to the Brokaw American community. But Brokaw went on to point out, and this I think you've heard this before, but he goes on in his apology, says, from my days reporting on Cesar Chavez.
Hold it. This is going to be a record of how pro-Hispanic he's been his entire career, right?
To documenting the many contributions of Hispanics in all parts of our culture, I've worked hard to knock down false stereotypes. Now, to me, that sounded like some of my best friends are Hispanic.
I've got some of my best friends are black. Exactly. Scotty, I obviously we've been talking about this free speech and versus political correctness and social justice warriors and all of this. But I have to tell you, you use the term broach the walls of it. And for the first time, I really see things in a very different light. And I would encourage our listeners to see them in a different light as well. And here's what I mean. I just want to elaborate on what I just said. These restrictions on what you can say, and much more importantly, what you can think, are placed there by people who want power and money. These are not moral people, and they have no moral outcomes. They may state that they're morally inclined, but you can talk about the best intentions. If you're murdering people, you're still murdering people. So these rules and these walls that have been erected by people who have no moral, intellectual, or any other kind of superior over us. And people put themselves inside those walls because they are so weak-willed that they've come to believe that only the smart people and only the good people are inside the walls. Well, as those walls continue to thicken and as they continue to constrict, the people inside that little fortress of insanity are finding it a little bit tighter and a little bit tighter, and even now their own movements are restricted. And the part that I would just ask our listeners to consider, the sane listeners, is once you're outside the wall of political correctness, you're free. You're free. Once you are outside the wall, if you're willing to take the slings and arrows, which are getting smaller and weaker as they get shriller and more numerous in a strange sort of way, once you're outside the wall of political correctness, you're not constrained by anything. I can say anything I want to. I like to think that I'm constrained by decency, good manners, and an absolute dependence on the truth as I see it. I'm not actually limited by that, but I'm self-limited by that. But these people have to wonder, and when we talked about Martina Navratilova and all the rest of them who get bitten, these progressive champions get bitten because they weren't progressive enough. I can't imagine that Kevin Hart loses the Academy Award hosting opportunity and then goes home and thinks about what an awesome, awesome, awesome thing it is to be a progressive.
Well, ladies and gentlemen,
Bill Whittle
I
Now
will
is
let
brought to you by
Bill
the paying
do
members
the.
of BillWhittle.com. It's a small community of people who feel that these messages are important and are willing to pay for them because they cost money to produce. It's a very small number of people compared to the total number of views that we've had, and to those people, we continually send out our gratitude and our real humble thanks and respect. Uh, as for the rest of you layabouts and slackers, um, if you've been watching these programs and they mean something to you, consider becoming a member at BillWhittle.com. Things are getting cleaned up over there as far as the website's concerned pretty quickly, thanks to the work of Scott Ott, which doesn't require the use of his vocal cords. And I think on that note, we will close this episode of Bill Whittle Now with Scott Ott. I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.